There were several big and important wins for progressives on Tuesday, as 7 states held primaries for the crucial 2018 midterms. But the biggest news by far seems to be the defeat of longtime Wall Street-funded establishment Democratic Congressman Joe Crowley by upstart first-timer Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, a progressive 28-year-old Democratic socialist and Bernie Sanders acolyte, which the media and political world seem to be characterizing today, as you pointed out at The Nation, as a political earthquake. Why is this such shattering news, John Nichols? It's just one race in liberal New York City, after all, and one in which just, 25,000 or so Democratic voters turned out on Tuesday.
Well, it goes to the conversation we were just having, right? Because there has been a sense that Democrats, even reasonably liberal Democrats, and it's important to understand that Crowley was a reasonably liberal Democrat, don't seem to be sufficient to the moment, right? There's an awful lot of grassroots Democrats who are deeply concerned about whether their party is ready to do two things. Number one, fight in the moment we live in, the struggles that need to be done, and notably, the challenger in this race, Ocasio-Cortez, went down to the Texas border as part of her campaign to highlight the immigrant rights issues that were in play in recent weeks. She really understood the significance of wrapping in all the battles of the moment, right, and being on top of them, ahead of them, aggressive. So that's number one, right? Fight the battles of the moment with an energy and a focus that, again, a lot of Democrats seem to lack. But secondly, fight the battles of the future. Get ready for where the party has to go. And it's very notable. This is, I think, relatively well covered, but I would still argue not sufficiently. This challenge was mounted by a member of Democratic Socialists of America who identified as a Democratic Socialist, who in interviews talked about, why she was a Democratic Socialist, and also a very, kind of boldly progressive individual whose campaign in many ways extended from not just the Bernie Sanders campaign, for which she had been an organizer, but from the many movements that are in play now on economic and social and racial justice and criminal justice reform issues, just a host of consequential movement struggles. And why I say that's the politics of the future. We've talked about this before, Brad. We are in the midst of radical changes that have nothing to do, or very little to do, with Donald Trump. We're in the midst of a globalization revolution, a digital revolution, an automation revolution. Our society is changing in fundamental ways, and we need a lot more ideas, and we need bolder ideas to be able to handle these changes. And I think that a chunk of young voters, especially in that Bronx and Queens district, recognize that need.
You argue at The Nation today that most Democratic leaders have been very slow to recognize the intense yearning for economic and social change amongst their own base and among the millions of voters who could be rallied to the party line if it offered a dramatically bolder vision. And I agree with you, but that was also the argument that Bernie Sanders made before not being able to rally enough voters to his bolder vision to win the Democratic presidential nomination in 2016. And a number of his endorsed candidates have failed to win nominations elsewhere in the country so far this cycle. So what makes you so sure, John Nichols, that there are those millions of voters out there who, enough to actually flip red seats to blue this November and a red White House to a blue White House in 2020?
Well, let's note that when we were talking about this just a moment ago, I suggested there were two factors, right? One was, that energy from the Sanders campaign and all of the kind of Sanders-focused analysis, which we hear a lot of. But secondly is also that involvement with movements, Reaching beyond even where Sanders went into immigrant rights, racial justice, criminal justice reform, full on for single payer, full on for, as in this case, Ocasio-Cortez talking about housing as a right, a whole host of fundamental economic and social issues. I think there's a space there, but you can't go cautious on it. And it's not to say that some of the candidates who were defeated were cautious, not necessarily the case, but there are ways to hit your mark. And what was interesting yesterday is that you saw a number of instances where candidates hit the mark. It isn't just this race in New York City. You also had in Maryland Ben Jealous, who was a key Sanders backer from 2016, former head of the NAACP, a remarkable individual in his own right on a host of issues and great resume, great history, running for governor in a crowded primary. Pretty much the whole of the Maryland establishment was lined up against him. But he put together a coalition of unions, activists, young people, people of color in especially the Baltimore area, and he prevailed. He didn't just win by a little. He got 40% in a 9-way primary, 11 points ahead of his next closest competitor. That's a big win. And I cannot begin to emphasize, I've followed this race closely. What Jealous did was not merely say, I want to shake things up, or I want to be a progressive, or blah, blah, blah. Much like Ocasio-Cortez, he had an incredibly detailed agenda. I mean, this was a visionary campaign that talked about the future in all sorts of ways. And if I give you one other example, out in Colorado, Emily Sirota won a state legislative fight. And it was a fight between what a lot of our media might identify as two liberals. Her opponent was a relatively progressive woman as well. And yet there was a real divide there as regards intensity and passion. And Emily Sirota took very, very bold stands as regards labor rights. She was even attacked in some instances for being so bold in having done so. But she won that primary, and she'll end up in the legislature. And Ocasio-Cortez in New York will end up in Congress, because these are pretty Democratic districts. Jealous has a tougher fight. But boy, if you watched him last night as he declared victory, he was going right to the heart of the matter of an expansive, turnout building, generationally focused campaign.
I have been kind of brutal over the last several weeks against those progressives, not all progressives, but those progressives who, continue to say, oh, there's no difference in the party. Why bother in the two parties? Why bother voting? If they can't tell that, yes, there is a difference, and that even a terrible Democrat in the middle of this national emergency, even a terrible Democrat turns out to be better than a Republican. So, I've been telling those progressives, we're in a national emergency. You need to vote for the guy or the girl with D by their name, period, this November until we get out of this mess, even if you don't like that candidate. But the same thing is true for the establishment, the leadership. Will the establishment Democrats join in and really get behind these progressive candidates like Ben Jealous in Maryland and Ocasio-Cortez in New York and elsewhere across the country when they win their primaries?
They better. If they don't, they will literally wreck the party. Right? You can't play those games anymore. People are very, again, this is a media shift as much as a political shift. We've democratized information about how parties operate. And people at the grassroots find out whether the party is, withdrawing support or limiting support or not doing enough. So you can't play the old games anymore. That's the number one lesson. The number two lesson is that you've got there's a push and pull here, right? Many Democratic leaders are actually quite progressive folks, but they've been cautious because they think they have to be cautious, right? They imagined a certain kind of politics. They got into a habit of compromise. Wins like this, advancements like what we saw yesterday in a number of races, suggest that there's another way. And it's very important that suggestion, come through, that it be taken seriously.
Mm-hmm.
I tend to think you are correct in, you look, you really want to see a shift in Congress because you want to have a checking and a balancing of Donald Trump that the Republicans simply won't do. And one of the ways to think about this thing is take a look at the Congressional Progressive Caucus, a caucus that generally has members who are very progressive on a host of economic, social, foreign policy issues. Not all of them the same, but many of them really in a good place. I've just been running analysis recently on a number of Congressional Progressive Caucus members who would be committee chairs or key subcommittee chairs if Democrats were to take the House. And that's a way to think about it. Even if your local Democrat may not be the greatest thing in the world, that you are empowering some very progressive people to run committees and to actually decide on how legislation advances, how issues are dealt with.
Yeah, and how, by the way, how Supreme Court justices are replaced when it comes to the U.S. Senate.
That is true. Yeah.
And so that's why, even if you have to hold your nose and vote for Joe Manchin in West Virginia for Senate, if that means that the Democrats take back the majority and can block some of this ongoing nightmare, I would argue that's a good thing. John, in 30 seconds, I got real Donald Trump today saying on Twitter, the Democrats are in turmoil. And of course, the right is pointing to these progressive victories on Tuesday as signs that the party is, they take the word socialist and turn that into Marxist. How do you respond to that narrative coming from the right? How do you counter this corporate media narrative that we're going to hear about the Democratic Party moving far, far to the left, as Republicans have been pretending for so many years?
They only scream about it when they're scared.
Yep.
These people, look, our Republican friends are not all insincere, but an awful lot of them are. And the fact of the matter is, they know as well as you and anybody else does that when Bernie Sanders ran in 2016, a big part of what got people excited about him wasn't necessarily that they were all socialists or democratic socialists. That's not the point. But the fact that he was willing to identify in a way that was different, that was bold, that was potentially even some people saw as a little threatening, that was what people thought. That's what people wanted. They want something more. And again, this isn't just a simplistic thing of saying, yeah, everybody wants socialism. That's not the point, or everybody wants, some sort of, incredibly bold progressivism. But what is clear is voters are sick and tired of status quo politicians who won't take a stand and won't be bold on anything. And Republicans would like Democrats to stay that way. And so with all due respect, if our Republican friends tell you, the Democratic Party's moving too far to the left, it's probably a good signal that the Democratic Party's doing the right thing.